Okay, so I'm Andy, a senior product designer for Defend, and today we'll be walking through some changes we'd like to make for vulnerability management and how we've come to decide on those changes. Quickly, vulnerability management exists within the threat management group in Defend. It's our only feature we have, and it's planned for minimal this quarter. We also have responsible disclosure, which is coming soon. So vulnerability management, in a nutshell, is think of it like project management for vulnerabilities in your organization. There's a workflow process and auditing in place, or that needs to be in place for our users so that they can successfully maintain their security posture for their organization. Today, vulnerability management will be minimal, or should be minimal soon. And then it will be based on our first framework, which was currently being in review. And right now, it's a pretty large overhaul of the database and how we're storing vulnerabilities, and then allowing users to interact with vulnerabilities. They're not quite like issues, but they'll have certain metadata and interaction points that make them more robust than they are today. So now our problem is how to prioritize the next step. So we wrote down a problem statement. How might we prioritize and plan the next iterations of vulnerability management? And our goal here was to test and validate a point of view on the next maturity level for vulnerability management. Our objectives are to leverage an MVC framework as a starting point. We don't want to make too many large-scale changes, just because it will be released soon. We want to inform the design decisions based on research findings, which we did a few months ago. We want to use jobs to be done to explore our solutions, which we've just wrapped up. And then we want to validate the prototype as a scorecard for the category. And if we do this, we believe we'll deliver value to users. So, we believe that users will be able to take appropriate action on vulnerabilities depending on where they are in their life cycle. We'll be able to give users more clear and informed decisions on vulnerabilities with contextually relevant data, and users will be able to control and visualize the entire vulnerability management lifecycle from one location. Our users are security analysts, and here's their jobs to be done. When I'm managing vulnerabilities for my organization, I want to quickly identify remediations that are slipping so I can take escalation action and avoid missing an SLA or worse, having my organization breached. And their secondary is when I'm managing vulnerabilities for my organization, I want to address all serious and time-sensitive threats first so I can ensure my company is not at risk of imminent breach or attack. And we have a secondary persona as well that we want to account for in these designs. When I'm evaluating my application security team, I want to have access to data pertaining to individual and team performance, so I can assess our effectiveness as a team and adhering to our security policies and identifying shortcomings that may be present. It might have been the longest job we've done so far. So back to the research. We did some kind of user flow, workflow analysis, and some light journey mapping with the application security team. Learned a bunch of things, and from that, mainly insights into their workflow. We were able to kind of synthesize how they were managing vulnerabilities from inception to resolution and wrap up into 3 main stages. That's triaging, then monitoring, and then resolution wrap up. So we took the approach of just creating some mid-level, mid-fidelity wireframes that we want to take to testing as a prototype. But we wanted to make more than just 1 or 2 changes to not really wanted to see the needle move. So we started with the foundational components that are going to be translated across the entire experience. And these elements are mainly just like the header and certain kind of interaction elements. And then we took all the insights we had from testing, as well as assumptions. So with those insights and assumptions, like, just good UX patterns and kind of what we've heard and kind of feel what I really didn't see in testing, we started mapping changes. And so I won't go through them all. There isn't a ton of time to do that, but you can see by doing this mapping during the actual research, we can kind of check our assumptions and say, like, component-wise or interaction-wise, this was or was not successful, and why. And by compartmentalizing it that way, we can make moving to the next steps a little quicker than just regenerating a whole new prototype and retesting and retesting. We wanted to be contextual as well. So each of these lists, since they're separated in tabs, will have different contextual information based on where the vulnerability is in its workflow. So that's one assumption we're ready to test, as well as like adding better tracking data with detected columns, which we've heard from users is something they want. Changing some terminology. So today we call these identifiers. I think that's just our back end creeping into our front end a bit. So the industry calls them warnings. So, an assumption is changing the name here might be a low risk. Let's give it a shot. As well as adding some new functionality, like telling users if there's a solution and what type of solution it is, because there could be multiple ones. Then we have resolution tracking itself. This is where users will come and kind of monitor how vulnerabilities are being remediated or if there's any problems in the process. So again, adding more contextually relevant data, like when it was triaged, taking a swing at removing the file and line information. So our assumption here, and it's kind of a high risk or medium risk, is users don't want to see this information after a vulnerability has been assessed. It's already under remediation, so we don't need to re-display it. As well as kind of breaking some patterns, but just not necessarily identifying if this is the right visual solution, but if this is just a solution users want to see as a pipeline view of the remediation status. So there are some new things that we'll be testing, but it's not going to be exactly what shows up in the final UI. And then the last phase is around the resolution wrap up, right? So we want to identify what features or data here is relevant, as well as call out where we're removing data that we had thought was relevant in the past. And some of those things, like adding in a disclosure column with status. We don't know how often this is going to happen, but we want to assume that this still wants to be tracked. An SLA delta as well, that's something that we can measure. So if we can measure it, maybe we should show it. And let's keep moving on. And then the last bit, which is kind of outside of the workflow, is just monitoring, auditing, and the single source of truth of vulnerabilities that have been dismissed. Vulnerabilities are dismissed because the organization chooses not to fix it. It's not a real vulnerability, or it's a duplicate. And some of the things we wanted to investigate is it useful to see who it's dismissed by? We heard that in testing. Does it need to be here? Could it be somewhere else? Again, removing data that we don't think is relevant, as well as adding in other data for tracking. So next, we're going to create a prototype with these screens, prepare them for testing, and then see how our assumptions go. And from there, we can prioritize and plan. And like always, there's going to be a loop back for iterative testing as well. And that's it. Happy to field any questions. If not, I will pass it on.
All right, I believe that
I'm I saw something in the chat from Nick. Would you like to voice that?
I just thought there's a really cool way of framing assumptions right there, so I just wanted to shout that out.
Oh yeah, for sure, thank you. It's actually funny when you map them, you kind of realize that I designed left to right overall.
Hey, Andy, really nice approach. I like that, the way you use the low fidelity designs first and then kind of like experimenting with giving numbers to the components. Really interesting approach. Thanks for
Thank you.
sharing.
Of course.